I still remember the afternoon. My neighbor Mark invited me to take a look at his new toy. He leaned casually against the hood of a shining black SUV, and I, just coming back from the animal clinic, smelled the disinfectant and dog hair clinging to my clothes. Mark smiled broadly, showing off perfectly white teeth, and told me he was upgrading to a new vehicle. He needed to get rid of this one as soon as possible, and seeing me standing by his driveway, offered me a good price. After all, I was one of his favorite neighbors, and he knew I was in constant need of purchasing a new car. Actually, I had saved up a decent amount of money recently. My old car was giving me nothing but trouble and taking a toll on my wallet, and Mark knew that all too well. He was the one who had encouraged me to buy an SUV in the first place. The price he was offering was more than sufficient, and the car itself was almost new. The papers were all in order, and the man even gifted me a full tank of gas. I was thrilled to have finally acquired a reliable vehicle, and spent the following evening driving around the neighborhood, admiring the car and marveling at the working air conditioning. Life went back to normal within a month. I was rushing to work every morning and taking the dog for walks on weekends. I used the SUV for everything, and my veterinary clinic remained fully stocked and operational. Everything was perfect, except perhaps that I still had to commute to my workplace. That was when the check engine light decided to blink angrily at me from underneath my dashboard one stormy Thursday evening. It was nothing serious, just a couple of sensors that needed cleaning. It took me a while to drag myself away from the pet hospital to bring the car to Mr. Davis, my trusted mechanic, but it was worth it. He promised to call me as soon as he noticed an issue, and assured me the car was in perfect condition. The call never came. On Friday morning, Mr. Davis called me straight to the garage, his voice heavy with something akin to dread. He asked me to come and talk in person. Something was wrong with the car. I knew he was one of the best mechanics in the business, so when he finally looked me in the eye and told me to bring the car back on Monday, I believed him. But when I walked into the garage on Monday and saw the yellow folder in his hands, I knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. My heartbeat pounded in my temples as the familiar scent of oil and gasoline enveloped me. Mr. Davis looked up sharply when I entered the room, his gaze fixed on the folder in his hands. His face was unreadable as he motioned for me to approach his desk. When I finally took the crumpled papers from his hands, my fingers trembled so violently I almost dropped them. The mechanic muttered something about a surprise discovery and gestured for me to read the documents in his hands. My eyes widened in disbelief as I took in the familiar handwriting scrawled across the top of the page. My name. It was my name, written in my father's handwriting in the year 2017. But my father had died 6 years ago, and I had no idea what vehicle he owned at the time. I stared at the papers in horror as the words blurred before my eyes. My father's name was not on the documents. Mine was. My father had never owned this car, and neither did I. Neither of us, until Mark allegedly stole it from us both. And yet, according to this piece of paper, I did. My hands shook as I glanced up at Mr. Davis. He gave me a sympathetic look and gestured for me to sit in a small wooden chair behind his counter. He asked me to recall whether I had ever given my name or personal information to anyone. I didn't need to think about it for long. The only person who might have had access to my personal information was my father. He had passed away 6 years ago, and I barely remembered him. But I did remember that he was a generous man, prone to gambling, sometimes with other people's hard-earned money. My stomach twisted as the realization dawned on me. That evening, I called my mother. She answered the phone in a hushed voice, her tone heavy with something akin to fear. Her silence spoke volumes when I finally asked her whether my father had ever been in trouble with the law. When I asked her what happened, she gave me the most detailed account of her father's life I had ever heard. My father had bought this vehicle several years ago and then sold it to a shady character, a neighbor of ours by the name of Mark. But he hadn't sold it in my name, at least, not initially. Father had intended to return it to the dealership after a few months, but he had fallen behind on payments and one day simply disappeared. The man who found him later claimed my father had been in debt up to his neck and, in a fit of desperation, had mortgaged me the SUV to pay it off. But I knew in my heart of hearts that this was not the whole story. Something else was going on, and I would find out what. It took me a few days to sift through the documents Mr. Davis gave me. Every single one of them stated my name as the owner. The vehicle had supposedly belonged to me the entire time, although my father had somehow managed to keep this from me. When inquiring about the car's history, I learned that he had driven it for almost 6 months before selling it to Mark. The odometer reading was suspiciously low, especially given the apparent age of the vehicle, and it turned out my father had tampered with the mileage. He had rolled it back several times, most recently just a couple of months before his passing. But again, it didn't make complete sense to me. Why would my father keep stealing from me? The pieces of the puzzle finally fell into place when I learned the truth about my father's and Mark's relationship. My father had been in dire need of money, and Mark, a cunning loan shark, had agreed to give him a sum of $30,000 in exchange for the car. But father had been unable to pay him back, and Mark, in turn, had kept possession of the vehicle. According to some of the documents, he had no intention of returning it to the dealership or selling it to another buyer. It seems he had grown fond of the car, or perhaps he was simply unwilling to part with such a large sum of money. The next morning, I drove the SUV to Mr. Davis's garage. The man was waiting for me when I arrived, a grim expression on his face. He led me to the back of the building and gave me a few more documents to review. They made me even more furious, if that was humanly possible. It turns out Mark had never transferred the car's ownership to me. He had simply continued to drive it for the past few years. I wanted to throttle him for taking advantage of me, but I bit my tongue. There would be time for that later. I was determined to get to the bottom of this mystery, and Mark would pay dearly for his insolence. That night I called him and, feigning surprise, told him the car was malfunctioning. I asked him whether he had ever experienced similar issues and assured him I would bring it to his attention. In fact, I wanted to see him sweat and hear him squirm when the truth came out. I told him to meet me at Mr. Davis's garage because the car was already there. He arrived on Saturday morning, his expression one of barely contained anger. I met him in the parking lot and welcomed him inside with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. Mr. Davis was waiting for him in the garage, his arms crossed over his chest. I gave him a cup of coffee and gestured for him to sit in one of the uncomfortable chairs. When he finally looked up at me, I handed him the folder containing the documents. His smile vanished instantly, and I watched, stunned and horrified, as his hands trembled. I asked him what he had to say about my name being on the papers, but he stuttered something about a clerical error and denied everything. When I produced the other documents, he looked visibly paled and started sputtering excuses. I told him I knew all about his deal with my father and that I had already contacted a lawyer. He should have known better than to take advantage of me, but he had made the mistake of crossing me. I also made sure to mention the illegal transfer of the vehicle and the falsified paper trail, telling him he would be held accountable for his actions. It was one thing to steal from my father, but quite another to rob me, the son and heir apparent. I knew he would face severe consequences for his wrongdoing, and I hoped, just hoped, it would be enough to deter him from doing anything like that again. As for Mr. Davis, he finally looked at me with something akin to respect in his eyes. He told me I had made a brilliant move by confronting Mark and making him accountable for his actions. I was glad to know that someone in this world still had a conscience. After all, Mark had spent the last several years living off my father's earnings, and now it was time to return the favor. The man was a parasite, a leech who had stolen from everybody he knew and had no qualms about doing it again. Mr. Davis assured me that, once released from prison, Mark would never cross paths with me again. He was a menace to society, and I had done the right thing by bringing him to justice. That evening, I sat in my apartment overlooking the city, the keys to the SUV still lying on the kitchen table. It wasn't the first time I had felt this betrayed, but it was by far the most devastating. For all his years of kindness and generosity, Mark had been nothing but a conman and a manipulator, preying on the kindness of others and living off their goodwill. In the end, he had gotten exactly what he deserved, and I was glad to be rid of him. However, I knew this was only the beginning of his long journey through the judicial system, and I prayed he would receive the punishment this cowardly act deserved. 2 weeks later, I walked into the courtroom, clutching the folder with yellow documents close to my chest. Mark was waiting for me on the other side of the room, his lawyer at his side. The man looked as smug as ever, though his tie was slightly askew and his shirt was wrinkled. He knew he was guilty, and I suspected he never expected to see me again. The police had investigated his conduct, and there was enough circumstantial evidence to convict him of fraud and illegal possession of a vehicle. Nevertheless, the burden of proof was on me to demonstrate why Mark had purchased the vehicle in my name in the first place. Mr. Davis was the first to testify, explaining that the car's mileage had been falsified and that Mark was aware of this fact. Then the owner of the auto repair shop testified, saying my father had purchased the vehicle several years ago and that he, too, was aware of the mileage discrepancy. Finally, my lawyer produced a set of documents proving that Mark had never actually owned the car. It seems he had grown fond of the SUV and decided to keep it for himself, a decision that ultimately led to his downfall. Mark's lawyer tried to argue that my father had sold the car to him in repayment of a debt, but there was little he could do to sway the jury. In the end, the judge ruled Mark was guilty of fraud and ordered him to repay me all the money I had invested in the car. The man was also fined for tampering with the vehicle's odometer. The verdict was a relief, but I knew justice would never truly be served so long as Mark continued to walk free. It took him several years to repay me, and he was forced to sell nearly everything he owned to do so. The entire ordeal was a wake-up call for me, and I vowed never to trust a man like him again. In the end, the only thing that had stopped him from running away was the sheer audacity of my accusation. I had confronted him with enough evidence to convict him, and in the end, it was enough to put him behind bars. That evening, I stood beside my father's grave, the familiar scent of gasoline and motor oil wafting from the SUV. I had kept my promise to him, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a measure of peace. Mark had taken advantage of me, and I knew he would never do it again. But I also knew the road ahead was long and fraught with challenges, and I was determined to meet them all, one by one, with renewed strength and resolve.